Mary through her work. And I read her incredible short piece of fiction in the Paris Review. And I remember I had that very excited feeling of having encountered something I hadn't encountered in a long time. This a piece of writing that was so moved from within itself and its own language and just so stylish, but in a kind of deep way. And I tracked you down, and we happened to have a friend in common, which was so perfect. And I'm just really excited to be here to be able to talk to to you about this wonderful example of your writing, and again, just remarkable prose. And I'm I'm really honored to be here with you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I love that you told the story about how we kind of came to know each other. And I had heard of you before because you are very good friends with Lexi Freeman, who I was hoping would make it here tonight. And she's sort of somebody I met at a writing conference a long time ago, and we became fast friends and shared a lot of sort of, I don't know, ways of looking at the world. Though she's 100 years younger than I am, but I felt very lucky to have her friendship, and now all the more blessed to be also to know you, and I know how much you mean to her and have meant to her, as a friend and also as a mutual reader of her work too. So I'm honored that you would read my work. Thank you for coming, and I want to thank everybody who's here joining tonight. I think several of my friends are here too, and it's just so lovely to be here. Thank you, and thank you to Chevalier's too. Why don't I go ahead and do a short reading from the book, and I'll just start with giving a bit of a summary of the book, or maybe just a little idea of where we are, because I'm going to read from about the middle. The book starts in media res, and it's a girl, 12 years old, named Olia'S, who's knocking on the door at 3 a.m. in the morning of what she understands to be her mother's cousin Jack's house in Riverside, California. And her mother is waiting for her in a cab in the driveway. Olia'S has sort of insisted that she has to have a place to live. She's been living an itinerant life with her mom, where they've either lived in tents on the street or in what she calls vacancies, which are motel rooms, or in the car. What immediately precedes her knocking on the door was an incident that occurred when she was alone in the car in Griffith Park. And she manages to escape, but she's so sort of shocked and worn out about it. She tells her mom she will not accept anything else but a house. And so her mother, finally under that pressure, takes her to Jack's house. The moment she knocks on the door and the door opens, a dog bursts through, and Jack is distracted pretty much by the dog. And we begin to learn who Jack is. Jack is a veteran of the Afghanistan War. This story takes place in 2006. And he has been trying to train this dog, which we learn he's kidnapped from the police department. He's been trying to train this dog to keep it to stay without any success. Irina comes and goes in her child's life. She is a nurse and she wants to be a ballet dancer. She does come and go. And so Olia'S isn't at Jack's house very long before Irina leaves her there alone. So she and Jack sort of work out their conflict around the dog. And the section that I'm reading from now is with Irina returning and not liking what she sees, not liking how she feels Jack handled living with Olia'S, and she takes her away. But the only place they have to go really is back to a homeless camp. So I'm going to read from that section. The lights of downtown Los Angeles crowd the stars above the top floor of the garage. Mom parks at the edge of the encampment. It's still here, I say, surprised the police have not rounded up and shoved off all the folks. Mom turns off the engine and takes my hand in hers. It's not for us, Olya, but it's just for one night. Tomorrow we have place at Women's Center. She points through the windscreen at the far side of the encampment. See, there's Darla and her sister. They looked out for us before, remember? They'll be happy to see you. Come on, we can have fun. Darla and her sister hold paper plates above their dogs that circle on hind legs. Olya, Darla says as we walk up, don't you look pretty? Tall, says her sister. Darla makes room for us to set up beside them, but there is no room. Space near the fires goes quick. Darla offers her own crate to sit, but Mom says, we'll come back. I follow Mom along an aisle cramped between tents and some homes of cardboard. Joey waves at us from the fires, then squirts lighter fluid into a yellow barrel chunked with garbage. He throws in a match and the barrel rumbles up flames. Put some meat on you, he says, Ira. His eyes covering Mom. No space in the central ring, so we step into the outer where people sleep loosely, a lot without tents. The old woman still sits at her school desk, writing on a sheet of paper leathered with ink. This far from the fires, the cold comes on. Mom unrolls the tent and I slide the poles through the orange sleeves. She stakes the asphalt. Mom is quiet, so I am. So much to tell and nothing to say. My time at Jack's house shapes in words born of walls in rooms. How would they sound inside this tent we can hardly see to set up? Mom, tie down the stakes. Look, there's Mr. Prince, she says, dropping her side of the tent and walking away towards someone strumming a guitar beyond the barrels. I set down the pole and follow her into the music and the moving shapes, slow and easy, circling the sparks that rise with the office buildings cooled and blue. I style you, Olya. Wood steps out of the dark with her scissors. She pops a long t-shirt over my head and pulls my arms through the sleeves, then snips at the collar, the sleeves, the waist. Wood can scissor up the clothes she rummages better than anything in shop windows. Mom blinks up at the light rain falling. Joey tells her to eat already, hands us each a hot dog stuck on a stick. The hot dog ignites and crisps to black over the fire. You out of practice, Joey says, and takes my charred one. He eats the hot dog, his lips smacking on the burn. Wood spins me around. She scissors and rips, her head tilting side to side. I go arms akimbo, modeling. Darla and her sister come up, and I spin round to face them. The cut doesn't suit her, Wood, Darla says. No? Wood clips fringe at the hem. She squints up at me. You change, Olya. Wood spins me around, then Darla spins me, then Mom spins me too. I stretch out my arms and whirl, the guitar strums faster, and the lights of the city fall over our heads, all together, clap, clap, stars.
Thank you so much, Mary.
My pleasure.
So I think I want to start, as I said, encountering the work for the first time. What I was so drawn by was the prose and sort of the musicality and energy of that prose. And I'm not the only one who's noticed this, obviously, about your prose. Noy Holland calls it zizzy, which I love as a descriptor. And there's also a beautiful piece about A Way to Stay and Plowshares, which everyone should take a look at. And Laura Spence Ash talks about the writing as writing that shines and illuminates and lifts the story up. And I think something about that description made me wonder if in this book in particular, you were moved first by, the sentence, the sound, or if the story was the thing that sort of propelled the writing, or is it, a mix of the two, or, can you tell us a bit about the process of writing this?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that question. I would say that usually when I start writing, I'm usually think about something that's somebody does that is sort of transgressive. That's usually just how I start a story. And then I want to explore what that means and I'll follow it along. But the only image I had for this, if I had any kind of plot image, and I usually was this story I heard from my brother-in-law about a hunter in Northern California whose dogs would sleep under his like camp house, and the only way he could his hounds, and the only way he could get them out was to shoot the floor at them through the floor, and they would come out. Apparently, he never hit them, but he had a lot of holes in his floor. And I, for some reason, that just struck, it stuck with me in that way that, like, that sort of like, why would someone do that? And so it was just that image. That was all. And I circled around it. And what I was really most interested, though, was not particularly necessarily the image, but it was actually sound. I really wanted to imagine what it sounded like to be sort of deprived of the most basic amenities that we think of having as sort of in our middle class or upper class or whatever, our American Western lives. And we just sort of take for granted shelter. We take for granted the regularity of a home and food and all those things. And it's even, I think we're all quite shaken right now looking on and at Ukraine, and just the absolute destruction of what was just normal for so many people is just blown out of the water right now. And we see it also, if you live in a city, I think you see a number of homeless people. And so I was just kind of thought, what is the language of that kind of deprivation that she's endured? And would it affect kind of a person syntactically? And I was also interested in the fact that I figured the only consistent text she had was the Bible. And I thought that's that kind of curious effect of, like, it would impart some great wisdom in somebody, but it would be sort of that odd imbalance of a kind of maybe a wisdom and an insight, but also just having not much utility in the normal everyday happenings. And then the last thing I would say is that I was just interested in, I don't know, what it sounded to go from being unsafe to being safe, and if those sentences would change.
I want, do you feel that, I'm trying to think about this, do you feel that the sentences did change as you were writing, as Oli'a becomes more, this sense of deprivation sort of gets less acute? I'm curious about that.
Yes, absolutely. It was easiest to render in dialogue, right? So, I mean, that was the easiest to show that she would speak up for herself, defend herself, be more sort of self-actualized and entitle herself to greater knowledge and say that think of herself as more deserving of things. But the language, I was thinking that it is somewhat language, and that gets really nuanced, but what it was maybe more, that makes more sense to talk about is how the point of view, how close she was to the experience itself. So I feel like early on, she's sort of somewhat distanced and more of an observer, and a little bit cooler and more in like her own silo. And as the relationships build, and she learns and she starts having these relationships with people, Jack and the dog, and even McFate, people that she doesn't necessarily even think are great. They're not exactly role models of ideal parents or anybody, but she just starts to kind of enter into her own skin and her own body. And I think she moves into that point of view she was further from, if that makes any sense. She kind of moves into her body and her language.
That does make sense. I think it's interesting too to think of her as someone who, I mean, she's 12. It's this incredible moment of being on the cusp, right? And she does kind of transition also into more of her desire for home, her desire for other people, So that does make sense to me. I mean, this might be a little bit of a repetition because you touched upon it a little bit, but one of the things I found so winning about this main character is that she is both so knowing and sort of wise, and also quite gullible and young and naive, and really believes her mother's lies in particular. And I'm wondering how you sort of struck that balance, which is the beautiful balance of that age as well, of being kind of both knowing and unknowing, kind of naive and also so wise in some way. Were you sort of thinking about that as a balance that you wanted to strike, or is it something that just emerged naturally from your sensitivity?
Um, no, it's something I think I dislike immensely in the coming of age novel is
Okay.
wildly too knowing of a
Mhm.
narrator. And because it wasn't an adult looking back. It's in the present tense, so it's not an adult looking back. So I couldn't. The stance was such that she's right in the moment that she's telling us the story. So she has no adult wisdom to bring to this thing, to what she's relaying to us. Even in The Catcher in the Rye, he's 9 months out from the episodes that he's retelling us from, and he hasn't learned anything either. But that's probably, I think, big part of the gag in that. But I've always, I always admired something like The Catcher in the Rye, even though I didn't much like the book. I always, for a long time, I admired how well he creates his sort of the right, Salinger creates that kind of, you know, uh, tough, cynical voice, which is all cover, right, for his pain. And Olia to me is not covering pain that much, but she's also doesn't wallow in it. She kind of just goes along and just tries to make out as well as she can. I think that the one thing I do think would certainly be true is that her predicament is so unsteady and unpredictable that I think causes a huge hypervigilance in a person, particularly a young person. And all children are attentive to their parents, sensitive, highly sensitized to their parents' expressions and their moods and all that. But somebody who doesn't know if where they're going to be from one day to the next, if she's going to stay in school this week or if she's going to move on, she's almost going to be in an anticipatory, reading of how what her mom will do next. So she would almost become like a barometer or something. So I think that hypervigilance gives her a kind of insight and wisdom to others. And then in terms of her naivete, I just think that there are things for her that knowing is too painful. She can't know. She senses things. She senses there's something up with Jack and with Irina and all that. But knowing is painful. And I think that she's still at the age where you trust your parents. You trust what they've done. It's not a story necessarily about deciding your parents are terrible and you're moving on.
No, not at all. In fact, it remains quite tender, right? Even as the realizations are more and more painful for her. I wonder actually if you could talk a little bit about how you managed the world of secrets in the book, because I think it's quite well, in a kind of plot way, and obviously I don't want to give anything away. You managed to hold back quite a bit of important information about how all the characters are connected, and yet you don't do it in a way that feels withholding, nor does it feel like Olia'S is just not seeing anything. And I'm curious if that was a challenge or.
Um, if anything, the challenge was just sort of supplying more hints. I mean, I think that, for example, I had to remind myself, you must ask the question that the reader might be asking. So, I have Olia ask many questions that, in a sense, are answered. And if she feels like listening to the answer is there. but then she sort of over determines the answer and overreads what's there. She's continually, a window keeps opening and she could look through it. But I think that it's she that isn't ready to look. And so I guess I think to some extent that I've often thought it was interesting that they say that they remember there was this kind of psychological theory that was going around about secrets in a family, and that if there was a big secret in a family, that the whole family could be sort of dysfunctional because of that secret. That there's some kind of knowing that is inexpressible beyond language, but it's a feeling. And her family is so dysfunctional that you wouldn't need to wonder what was behind it. But I think that I think that she's just not ready to know, and that is was the main goal of the novel, was to stay so much in her point of view, without it being oppressive, that that we only know what she knows for the most part.
I think that's actually really nicely handled, and it isn't oppressive. I think that's what's quite remarkable about it, even being the perspective of quite a young person who doesn't see everything. And yet I think because of the dialogue and how much exterior action there is, you're both very much inside of her consciousness and in the outside world. That is actually something I was quite curious about, just because I sometimes, as someone who writes in a more interior way, I was amazed at how you balanced the interior and the exterior. This actually quite action-packed novel with a lot of, in a lot of violence, mostly perpetrated by Jack, the man who shoots who shoots at the deck in order to get the dogs to move. I'm wondering if you were sort of conscious of that as these elements that you were balancing.
Very much. I tend to, I think well, I love sometimes I think, literature just falls, literary works fall somewhere, between Moby Dick and To the Lighthouse, where in terms of almost styles, there's the action adventure journey, right? And the whale hunt and all that. Or there's the really interior novel where you still actually are going to a lighthouse and still about water, but it's this immensely sort of interior work. And I profoundly admire To the Lighthouse. It might be one of my very, very favorite books. And I really admire Moby Dick. So, but I think I always enjoy when I read, I kind of like that combination of really literary language and a protagonist and interiority combined with action. And I enjoy reading action in a novel, and I kind of frustrated by the thought that somehow action sort of puts it in as a genre novel. I mean, why would the fact that people are actually doing things and expressing themselves through actions be considered something dramatic, that's not literary? But it also comes from my background in screenwriting, and so that is not. It'd be unfair of me to say it doesn't. But it's not exclusively that. I do like writing that has a physicality to it. I really do. So I guess I was trying to capture some of that too.
Yeah, I think it's actually, for me, unusual to see that mix, and especially, and I don't mean to, I'm probably generalizing a little bit, but with a young female protagonist, there's so much, she's not just sitting around in her room, right? She's getting in there. And I wonder too, actually, how much having animals and dogs in particular as part of this, so wholly part of this narrative, helps in that sense, or makes it impossible for it to be this static, this
Yeah.
static narrative. And I'm curious, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you think of these animals as characters, or, I think I was thinking, are these, are this, is Bird just a metaphor? Is he just a kind of stand-in? I feel that's too anthropocentric for you. I think that's not how you think of animal characters. So I'm curious to hear about that.
Well, first, I just want to go back and just say between, the interiority and the description of action or the action in the story, that was something that I really, if there was any major challenge in the book, it was that challenge between having her be the person who's telling the story and the person who's in the story and processing it. And I would often think about, like, the first person, they say, is the problem that you create for yourself, or it is Eudora Welty said, it casts the longest shadow. And so in a way, I understood that, because it was like, okay, she's 12, she's got to tell what's going on. She's got a kind of madman and a dog that are going to just make things antic. And she's got to, keep in her own perceptions and her own reading of the situation constantly, which would be like her interiority. And so that was really the central task of the work. So I want to say that it wasn't like, oh, it just fell out. I had to continually grapple with how to do that. And I think it taught me a great deal, trying to figure that out. In terms of the dogs, I will say, animals figure often in my work. I mean, the story that you said that you read that you were moved by is Hive. And that was based on all the bees that lived in our house. And, I grew up kind of more, I guess, like the active child, because I was always out, catching turtles and frogs and that kind of thing. I was always actively out with animals. And I love, the dog is actually the dog. The dog has its own narrative. Someone once said that the dog was sort of Job on 4 legs, because it suffers in a sense. In many ways, the dog suffers in a way that the others in the story are just too self-absorbed to do it. But Bird is a dog in the story, and I tried to bring out her dogginess or his dogginess as literally and realistically as possible. And when animals are in my stories, they're not metaphoric. They are a thing in my story, and I do think that there's, as we sort of enter into this universe of trying to understand what we've done to the planet, perhaps one of the things that we will begin to reckon with is what we've done to animals. That's another story. I think the dog is also functioning as a double for Irina, very, very specifically. That's how I had thought of it also, because Jack can't get the dog to stay. That's the main command. He can't master with her, but he can't get Irina to stay either. And the only person that he can get to stay is Oli'a, who he doesn't want her to stay, right? So, but she teaches him something about that by virtue of just staying. And then the dog, I would also say, serves a sort of wonderful function, is what I think of as like the third object. So I didn't want a situation where, my dog is whining, it's perfect in the background. I didn't want a situation where the Jack and Oli'a were going at each other. I mean, that would just be very strange and kind of uncomfortable and just not pleasant. He doesn't really know her. And mostly he's just not even interested in her. He's just fixated on the dog. So the dog becomes this thing that they can kind of talk to each other through. So I would say that it's also operating as like a vehicle or third object for their feelings.
Absolutely. And at one point, doesn't Oli'a say, I don't forget the exact line, but she says, what would he talk about if he wasn't talking about the dog? Like, if he might have to talk about how he actually feels, which is just a moment of extreme insight. But their dynamic, Jack and Oli'a, sort of through the dog, is really quite remarkable. It's this young young girl and this older, pretty wild, wild man. And you feel that violence and kind of tension within him, and yet they seem to build something that's relatively safe in some way. So I do think that the dog, that Bird, sort of softens in some way the rapport, in a really interesting way.
Yeah, Bird also protects her, which is in many ways
right.
the first time she really had anybody really, really protect her at the most fundamental level. The dog protects her.
Yeah.
And she's never even had that experience.
Yeah, it is a really moving, not in any way saccharine relationship between, Olia and the dog. Absolutely. I think one of the other things that it's impossible to talk about this book, just, from the title to this opening passage, to talk about the relationship between, this Olia and her idea of home. I forget what she says. She says, she says home is, sorry, I'm just going to look for it because it's so lovely. She says a home is how a place becomes known. And that's a bit later in the book, as she's becoming very attached to Jack's house and what it might represent for her. And I wanted to know a little bit more about what home means for Olia, and also in comparison maybe to the other characters, to Jack and to Irina. I'm curious about that.
Well, thank you for pulling that line. I think it's, I think that all of her knowing what she knows in the secrets, what she doesn't know, her whole sense of knowing she feels is completely faulty because she hasn't known a home. So she feels that there's something essential about being in the world and about knowing what everybody else knows, because she hasn't had the experience of a home. And so it's almost like she doesn't know who she is because she hasn't had a home. And this is just, maybe it's not true for everyone, all right, but it's just true for her. And I think she has a really idealized idea of what home is. I think she thinks of it as sort of consistent, predictable, secure. And most importantly, it doesn't have any people in it. That's really important to her. And when she makes her model, it doesn't have her little model home, it doesn't have people in it. And that's really important to her, because to her, she sort of can't see how people can be in a home and the home can all be all secure and predictable and all these things. She can't put those two things together. And so she's sorely tested. If she has such an idealized idea of home, she comes into a home that tests her in every single way, even down to the walls of it, the home itself by the end. And so I think that she needs to sort of do the journey of understanding that actually home is people, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot again with this Ukrainian crisis, is watching people emigrate with, not even their whole family, right? Just mothers and their kids, maybe their sisters, but the men are not coming with them. And so I was thinking how that could be even more profoundly, if they are families in a typical, heterosexual way, that they may be even more, sense of their home being destroyed, because home is really ultimately that family. And in a way, I felt like just as much as she needed to get a home, she needed to sort of process through home and meet family and get to family, because it was really family that she was searching for. For Irina, a home is just terrifying to her. She's really, it's 2006 when this was made, and when this book occurs. And so she's closer to the post-Soviet era. And her mother and her grandmother would have grown up, but her grandmother probably while Stalin was still alive, and then her mom in that post system. And one of the most effective things about the Soviet system and under Stalin was that there was a complete eradication of the centrality of the nuclear family. And it was replaced with the state. And so your first and primary allegiance was to the state, not to the family. And these kinds of, psychic disruptions in a person's identity played out generationally. She left home when she was very young to go to become a ballet dancer at the Vaganova school, and so she's even separated from her family. And she just does not trust family. Family to her, home to her, is a place where it's not safe. It's absolutely not safe. So part of what makes her continually moving is the sense of not getting held someplace where she could be, I don't know, just become unsafe. And the arts are the place in Russia at the time that she was growing up with, being a dancer, being an artist. That's the arts were the place that you could at least find respect from the system and from the culture and from the government, and therefore, in some weird way, be safe again. So I think that's what's so complicated about her identity, and why she may come across as inordinately unsympathetic, depending on your point of view. Some people find her that way. I certainly do not. And then for Jack, I sort of think as with home with Jack is just like, it's like food rations and a house to put your head. He's really, and the house is just crumbling down around him, and it's sort of really extension of him. And the one thing he just really does well is to make food for everybody. He's like, you have to be fed. And so that's, I guess, how they feel about home. Jack,
This
for
is
Bird.
surprising.
For Bird,
It's a surprising. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not. I just want to say that I was thinking that for Bird, because I love your question, and it came to me, and I thought for Bird, I think home is just a dream. It's like a dog dream, because poor Bird doesn't really get much of one, and so it's just a dream that he keeps having. Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's a lovely, no, that's a lovely image. I really appreciate that. I was thinking a bit about Irina and whether or not, she's sort of sympathetic. It's this like constant question, is this character sympathetic? Maybe not the most interesting question, but I wondered a little bit about her kind of somewhat deluded quest for the return to the arts, which actually we realize is not quite as deluded as we thought it was, or at least as a reader I felt, is this a total fantasy? And it's actually somewhat, it's a bit of a relief that it isn't, to a certain extent. But I wondered if the mother and daughter kind of consider one another home. There's this kind of both familiarity and estrangement between them, which I think is nicely handled. It's, again, not at all sentimental, and yet you see that they are tethered to one another, even though Irina is constantly trying to escape her daughter. I wonder if that was, again, I feel that was probably a balance that was quite challenging to strike.
Yeah. I feel sympathetic to, it's like the Lit Hub piece I wrote looking at different stories about, women with secrets. And I feel and I have forever, I feel very sympathetic to what we've asked about mothers, historically, and how to pursue what is deeply meaningful to them is considered, somehow not fulfilling their maternal duties. And yet there's so much built into our system to enable the male to do that. And I do think it's changing. And I think one of the ways it is changing is by really asking about what our expectations and our judgments have been. But of course, this is, not true everywhere. And I think we can look at what's happening with Roe versus Wade across this country, and we can absolutely understand that it's a fraught subject. Just as there's progress, there's also constriction. So, I think that she has absolutely no doubt that given the right time and chance, she will dance again. I mean, that's part of her gift, her talent. But she also, her complication is not so much with her child; it's really with Jack. It's actually, and that's one of the secrets that's so hidden, and of course, Olia might be likely to take the blame for it because she doesn't know enough. But but she is neglectful of her daughter to a degree that most people would find not tolerable, that she should have in fact just compromised completely and sacrificed, become the nurse that she didn't want to be, which is, I think of so many Russian women that have come to the US and been nurses, and I don't think they wanted to be, some of them, and I just was kind of, I think she's very sympathetic in that way. But of course, there's a sacrifice, and Olia talks about sacrifice from the first few pages. If there's not a firstborn, there's not anything to be sacrificed. There will be sacrifice, and I think that that's kind of the main one of the main ideas pulsing under this novel, which is, you can't have it all. You're not going to have it all. You're going to have to sacrifice. There is sacrifice, and that's how we actually, in some ways, come together as community. If we're not willing to sacrifice, then you can't. So I don't know where.
Yeah. No, there's a fissure right in the house. The house will not. The house might stand, but there is something right in the middle of it that is going to threaten it. I think that is very much in the DNA of the book, that this is going to be an imperfect coming together, whatever happens.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
I mean, home figures very much in or the leaving of home. I mean, one of the things I thought was interesting that the Plowshares review mentioned was that what's unusual about the book is that Olia'S going to home. She wants a home. She can't leave a home until she's had one. And many novels of coming of age are about taking off, and fledging and going away. And this is actually going toward home. And it's interesting because she's a young girl trying to go home. And in your novel, we have a mature woman who's actually fled home and trying, and not in any sense, from what I could pick up, is that she's trying to reestablish and rebuild home. And, I think the question of home is, I don't know, it's just such a compelling one right now. And I do think it's getting larger and larger as we are looking at more kind of global displacements.
Yeah, it's impossible to think that, not to think that Olia'S experience of home isn't being a sort of direct reflection or haunting from her mother's own displacement and migration. She holds it, right? Certainly. So I think, and Jack's homelessness from, the army and the police. I mean, I feel like these are all really interwoven in the book in a beautiful way.
Yeah. I think Cyan wants to.
Yes, hi there. I was thinking it might be a good time to go ahead and start our Q&A. So I mentioned in the chat, but if y'all want to type out your questions in either the chat feature or in the Q&A, either, just as long as there's like a place where I can read them out loud. And then I'll start with one question that I have. I like to ask people, especially with something like this where it's taking place, if like we have a lot of different narratives and like people what they've experienced, what was your research process like for something like this? Because I know that we mentioned like the Afghan War, you talked about Stalinist Russia, like what was the research process for even just getting like the logistics of what it would have been, like what people would have experienced?
Well, I didn't have to do that much research in Stalinist Russia because I have dinner every night with my husband, who's a Russian emigre. And he often regales us with these things. My husband, Eugene Yelchin, who writes about middle grade novels, specifically about coming of age in Russia, and writes brilliantly and is an extraordinary artist and writer. So that in that way, and I think, to some extent in the Russians I know, and in what I've witnessed from not really Eugene, but from different psyches around that my observations, I've come to understand a certain kind of way of being that is came from a certain history that is not ours. And then I think, what's funny, Cyan, this just like the question, what started first, your sense of language or some kind of a story. This, I'd never really researched much for this book because I just kept kind of pulling it out of itself, and I was just more interested in what the story was doing. But there was one place I did research, and that was about military dogs. I did research about military dogs. I did, I'd already written the character of Bird. I've kind of already written the draft or two. And then I just was thinking, God, this dog seems like it has PTSD. And then I started to do research and found out absolutely that those dogs are, those poor combat dogs suffer immensely from PTSD. And I was thinking also being the recipient of so much emotion from the soldiers themselves, they might be carrying some of that too. So that was actually an area I did research.
That's really interesting because I know it's especially about the dogs. Like I know there's a lot that a lot of things the general public doesn't know about how animals are used in that way. We do have a question in the chat from Cassandra. He said, first off, thank you, Sarah, for the great questions. Mary, I'm glad you mentioned sacrifice because I'm wondering whether one of the central conflicts or dances in the novel is that Irina feels that she existentially can't sacrifice herself. She can't she can't sacrifice who she is and what she wants for the concept of home or family. Whereas Oya seems to feel that family or home might precisely be the only thing worth sacrificing for.
That's a beautiful question. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Hi, Cass. And I agree with you, Cass. Sarah's questions are extraordinary and such a beautiful question interlocutor. Or I don't know, the way you said that was so beautiful when you said the word earlier, and now I can't even say it at all. Can you say it again, Sarah?
Interlocutor?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I just fumble over that word. Oh boy. Yeah, I think ultimately true. I think that by the end of the book, I think that Irina she will never sacrifice her artistic goals and her idea of herself as an artist. She will never be happy and cozy at home. It will never be a place of respite for her. But I do think that the one place that she has a shift, if not a sacrifice, a shift, is to actually fully recognize the cost of it for her child. At what cost her choices, how they affected her child. And there is a glimmering sense by the end that perhaps here and there she might maybe see her way toward putting her child first, if not to totally sacrifice her vision of herself, at least to recognize that her daughter is also occupying all her decisions and affected by them. But I do think that for Olya, yes, I think sacrifice to her is for home, and that it is an act worth sacrificing for, because to her it's how she comes into being. I think she's not actually a full being until she actually understands, in a sense, passes through what it might mean to be in a habitat.
Thank you for that. Well, we do have another audience question from Philip. Philip asks, I'm curious how you chose Bird's name. The freedom that actual birds have to fly and travel is quite a contrast to the human's constraints in the story.
Well, I had a dog named Bird, and when she would play with rocks on the hill, she used to kind of sing like a bird, like go like ho, 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 like while she ordered her rocks around. So that was one reason. And yes, I do absolutely was interested in this idea. She's also a bird dog. She's a kind of part Chesapeake, so those are bird dogs. So there's a sort of sense of hunter in her. But yeah, I think that I was very interested in this idea of flight, everybody kind of having this quality of trying to get away, taking flight. I mean, as soon as she meets Bird at the beginning pages, Bird is flying through the screen door and flying away from trying to get away from Jack. Bird might as well have wings. The way, if he could, he'd grow them and leave.
May I ask a final question if we
Yeah.
don't have that?
Mhm.
I have to ask because I know your screenwriting background. And for me, the dialogue in this book is just so hilarious and the repartee incredible. And I did wonder if it was, different for you when you're writing dialogue for fiction or when you're screenwriting. And it just seemed like such an important part of how this book kind of moves.
I wouldn't say that that I just have to say that I'm almost out of power, so I may have to hop up, but I may not. That No, I mean, I absolutely bring the same principles of dialogue to writing fiction as I do to writing screenplays. And when I think about great dialogue writers, I mean, I would say I really love writers like Sam Shepard and Martin McDonough, who are actually playwrights, right? So their ear is impeccable. But I'm also really like writers like Barry Hannah and Joy Williams, Cormac McCarthy. These are writers who also are happily inserting really often the incredible repartee, incredible great line in a line of dialogue. And I think those are one of the great pleasures of reading anything, whether why does it all have to go to this the movie or the TV show or the sort of that medium? I think that there have been all lines have been infinitely quoted from from great novels, and I think we remember novels, short stories, remember prose often from the lines, the dialogue lines. And I was thinking about how like dialogue is there's just something about that when you write dialogue, it allows the reader in a way. I think that the prose and the sort of more interiority of the prose doesn't necessarily allows them in a different way. But with dialogue, in a sense, the reader sort of makes sense of the scene, right? They watch the scene as it unfolds in the book, whether it's 4 lines exchanged or 3 pages of dialogue lines, and they become sort of the interpreters of the meaning and the resonance of the scene. And I feel like they're invited in a lot, very thoroughly through dialogue, and that it can carry a lot of emotion. And it doesn't, in fact, often, I think the worst dialogue is dialogue that carries too much information. I mean, I don't think ideally it carries almost none, right? It's just carrying feeling, emotion, and it actually reveals character. And so I could never not rely on dialogue in my work because I just love the sound of it. And I have to say, sometimes have to remind myself to remember to write prose. That is a confession. That's the truth. It's easy to fall into dialogue.
Thank you for answering that was a really burning question for me. So I'm glad I got that.
So I guess no more questions from the audience. Thank you very much, everyone who's made some time to come, and thank you for supporting independent bookstores. I think that's really something profoundly important that we all need to remember. Thank you, Cyan, and thanks to Chevalier's, and thank you so much, Sara, for your fantastic questions and your beautiful book, Tides. It is an astonishing book.
Thank you so much, Mary. Such a pleasure, and thank you, Cyan.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, thank you, everyone who's saying thank you in the comments. Yeah, again, I'll have a recording up if you know someone who wasn't able to make it. Look on our YouTube channel, and it's been a great talk. And I sent the link to Get a Way to Stay. So if you don't already have a copy, make sure to get it through Chevalier's or your other local independent store. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Bye.